I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And on occasions like this, and we already have done, acknowledge the tragic and ongoing injustices faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, and reaffirm my commitment and our commitment to standing alongside them in their struggle for equality and amplifying the Indigenous voices among us. So, why do I work on human rights and why do they matter? And I think there's been a bit of a theme here tonight, personally, and I think everyone pretty much has exemplified this tonight. I'm driven to tackle injustice. As Rosie said, I'm a woman standing against what is wrong. And I also think I'm driven because I'm profoundly optimistic about the capacity for humans to show care and compassion to each other. And I think the concept of human rights encapsulates both of these principles really nicely. Human rights provide a philosophical framework and a shared language, but also a tool to address injustice through collective action. And human rights give us that hope that we can be kinder to one another. In terms of my work, just as we've fought against injustice on the basis of race, on the basis of disability, gender, so too we're compelled to address discrimination and injustice against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, and other people within our broader community. Fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice. And sadly, LGBTIQ people still experience much fear and anger in this society. Just last week in Melbourne, the picture's up there, I saw some graffiti where some gay men promoting a campaign to end HIV were defaced with the words biohazard sprayed across them. And really, even in Australia, we're still coming to terms with the legacy of criminalisation, medicalisation and stigmatisation of people on the basis of their sexuality, their gender identity and their intersex status. I've been very lucky, and I think Australia's really led the world in apologising and making reparations to particularly gay men, but same-sex attracted people more broadly in regards to these historic wrongs. But as we know, many parts of the world still punish, even kill people simply because of who they are or who they love. And sometimes they flee to Australia and we send them to places that criminalise and punish them again. But I'm driven to continue the work that I do because I've seen what is possible when we do change hearts and minds, and the profound positive change that follows when the law finally does recognise your humanity. When a client of mine told me that he'd finally found the light in the darkness, when he was considered no longer a criminal in the eyes of the law, when his historic conviction was expunged from his record forever after living with it for decades. And more recently, after the marriage equality campaign, and I'll name drop here, I was at Magda Zabansky's house having a celebratory lezo lunch, and I was speaking to Glenn Clower, a musician, and she was saying for her, after the campaign, as a lesbian in her 40s, it was only when she was in the middle of a performance that she suddenly felt the release of the burden she'd been carrying for so many years, the burden of being thought of and treated as other and second class in the eyes of the law. And she started to cry while she was performing. And I think that's something that we've all done. When we've endured injustice, we minimise it because that's the way we survive. But it's this wonderful release and this wonderful freedom when we do finally become acknowledged. Now, did I think I'd spend so much of my professional life talking about people's sexuality and really quite intimate aspects of identity? If you'd asked me while I was studying law or advising companies in my 20s, I would have laughed, but here I am And after some years, I did work in law and then politics. The reason I came to work in human rights, I mean, I'd always been driven and passionate about injustice, but in terms of the LGBTI community, I realised that I had an enormous privilege and skills to offer to the community that I was part of. So then it began, and now I can't go to a gay nightclub or a queer festival. They're sort of ruined in a way, because I feel this great sense of responsibility and care for everyone around me. So it doesn't make for good separation of personal and professional life, but it's incredibly rewarding in other ways. Now I want to talk about the threats ahead. So I don't have lessons for you today because the threats ahead are too great and I feel we must address them. Because in the aftermath of last year's federal election, we have seen a false narrative emerge, peddled by far-right Christian lobby groups, that somehow the election victory is a result of protest votes by religious communities. And this obviously followed the Marriage Equality Postal Survey. And let's be clear, if marriage equality had been a federal election, we would have seen 133 of 150 federal MPs as yes voters. And at the same time last election, Lyle Shelton secured less than 6,000 votes for his Senate spot. So despite the fact that the LGBTI community was forced to endure an obscure, unnecessary and incredibly divisive and bruising process, the no side continues to try and extract its price for our equality. And the religious freedom agenda has unleashed itself, spearheaded by the Christian lobby and fed by the same misinformation and lies that we saw during the No campaign. So this is despite Philip Ruddock's review into the RF finding that there was no real threat to religious freedom in Australia. We now have a draft bill out for public consultation that threatens to wind back decades of progress for our communities. It licenses bigotry and it undermines inclusion. We've seen Binary Australia, formed around the same time as my organisation, Equality Australia, that's been launched to specifically stigmatise and marginalise trans and gender diverse people. And last year we saw the Murdoch Press jump on this bandwagon, and it's dedicated specific sections of its website to its hateful campaign around transgender young people. So the threats for the LGBTI community are all too real. But I want to be clear today that the Religious Discrimination Bill does not just represent a threat to the LGBTI community. It represents a threat to women, to people with disability, and ironically, to people of faith, particularly minority faiths. And all of those intersections and multiplicities of identity that can come in between and exist in society, those impacts of discrimination and potential threats are felt far greater. And of course, people of faith deserve protection against discrimination, but this is not a conventional discrimination law. This particular bill will stoke division. It will set us back decades, not just in inclusion more broadly, but access to healthcare. And, just to set out some examples, I think we can all agree that people in remote areas need to know that their healthcare workers will treat them without judgment. This bill threatens that. Women at work need to know they won't be told that God's plan is for women to submit to their husbands. This bill makes that a reality. Rainbow families and parents need to be confident that their children won't be told that their family is against God by a childcare worker. So this is a much bigger threat in my mind than not being able to legally marry. And it represents a threat to millions of Australians. The campaign's harder. It's a complex and abstract piece of legislation. It's not an easy soundbite to talk about discrimination law and exemptions and exceptions. But we've been working hard at Equality Australia, analysing the legislation, briefing MPs, resourcing industries and communities with the knowledge they need to fight back. And I really do feel like towards the end of last year, this bill finally has become a national conversation, and everyone in civil society has contributed to that conversation. And Australians are starting to wake up to the dangers of this legislation, because laws that grant special privileges to one group of Australians over and above another set of Australians are not laws that represent the values that Australians hold dear. these are Australians that respond with compassion and empathy when we have a national crisis like the bushfires before us now, and to pitch in and help one another when times are tough. In 2017, Australians voted for equality and fairness, overwhelmingly. They didn't vote for more discrimination. And we saw Australians stood up through that process for LGBTI people in a way that they'd never done before. And together we changed the face of the nation forever. So it would be remiss of me as a human rights lawyer not to point out that equality and fairness, the values that won us the marriage equality campaign, are the same values that underpin our human rights framework internationally. So in these difficult times when the country is on fire and we see authoritarian, anti-democratic trends across the globe, I think we need to hold on to the hope and the promise that was the marriage equality yes vote, and the hope that we can actually build a country that is caring of its people and includes all of us. And just to finish, I think human rights lawyer Brian Stevenson, and also I think Oprah, said that hope is our superpower. And it's because of this that I think we'll win. We win because we must. And we know that by standing together, we are stronger. Thanks very much.